If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I'd love to know.
A marriage marked by murder. Chapter 1. The invitation and the unease. "It is a wedding, Hastings," said Hercule Poirot, drawing a fold from the sleeve of his coat and smoothing it with grave concentration. "Not a guarantee of happiness." Captain Hastings, who was in excellent spirits and had spent the last quarter of an hour admiring the countryside through the carriage window, laughed lightly. "My dear Poirot, you are determined to find danger even in church bells and orange blossom." Poirot turned his head and regarded him with mild reproach. "You English, my friend, are forever deceived by decoration. You see flowers, ribbons, smiling faces, and at once you conclude that all must be well. But sometimes it is precisely when people strive hardest to create beauty that one should ask what ugliness they hope to conceal." Hastings smiled. "Well, for once, I intend to enjoy myself. A fine country house, a fashionable wedding, agreeable company. What more could one want?" Poirot gave a soft sigh. "Truth," he said. The carriage passed through the iron gates of Rosewood Manor and rolled slowly up a broad gravel drive lined with yew hedges clipped into dark, solemn shapes. Beyond them stretched winter lawns touched by pale sunlight, and at the top of the rise stood the house itself, large, handsome, and old enough to possess both dignity and secrets. Its grey stone front was softened by ivy. Tall windows reflected the faint brightness of the afternoon. White flowers had been arranged upon the steps and around the entrance, but from a distance the decorations looked less festive than fragile, like brightness placed over something cold. Servants hurried in and out beneath the portico. Motor cars stood in a neat line near the drive. Ladies in elegant coats emerged with muffled laughter, and gentlemen adjusted gloves and scarves against the sharp air. Everything suggested wealth, order, and a carefully managed celebration. Yet, before the carriage had fully stopped, Poirot's eyes narrowed. "There," he murmured. "What is it?" Poirot did not answer immediately. A tall footman had come down to open the carriage door, and Hastings stepped out first. Poirot followed with his usual precision, glancing once at the broad front steps where the groom himself stood waiting to receive his guests. Julian Harrow was, Hastings thought at once, an unusually attractive fellow. Fair-haired, well-dressed, and not yet hardened by middle age, he had the sort of face people trusted quickly. He came down the steps with warmth and politeness both, extending his hand first to Hastings and then bowing slightly over Poirot's. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, how very good of you to come." "It is a pleasure," said Hastings. Poirot looked at him closely. "You are most kind to invite us, Monsieur Harrow. I trust all proceeds as it should." For the briefest instant Julian's expression altered. It was no more than a flicker, yet it was unmistakable. Something had passed behind the smile, fatigue, perhaps, or anxiety. "Yes," he said, "I hope so." It was an odd reply. Even Hastings noticed it, but before he could consider it further, they were being led inside. The entrance hall of Rosewood Manor was magnificent. Dark oak panels rose to a high ceiling crossed with beams blackened by age. A great fire burned in a stone hearth, casting a warm glow over polished floors, and silver bowls of white roses placed at intervals along the walls. A string quartet was tuning somewhere in the drawing room. There was wax upon the air, and flowers, and the faint perfume of ladies just arrived from London. And through all that careful elegance ran a thread of strain. It was not obvious, nothing so vulgar as open quarrelling or confusion. On the contrary, every servant moved efficiently, every guest behaved with correctness, every arrangement had been considered. Yet Poirot, standing for only half a minute in that hall, knew that this was not a happy house. A commanding woman in mauve silk approached them. Her jewels were handsome, her posture excellent, her smile controlled rather than warm. "My nephew speaks of little else but your coming, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "I am Lady Dorothea Ashcombe." Poirot bowed. "Enchantée, Lady Dorothea. You will find us rather less interesting than your usual adventures, I fear." "I am always interested by families," said Poirot gently. Something sharp moved in her eyes, though her smile remained.
That is a dangerous preference. Not always," said Poirot.
Before Lady Dorothea could reply, a booming voice sounded from near the staircase. "Well, so the famous detective has come to bless the proceedings." The speaker was a broad man in evening clothes, prosperous in appearance and too confident in manner. His hair was dark and brushed back from a heavy forehead. His waistcoat was expensive. His expression had that offensive ease common to men who have long believed themselves safe from consequences. Julian turned quickly. "Mr. Halverson." Benedict Halverson came forward with his hand extended, though whether in welcome or challenge it was difficult to say. "I've heard of you, Poirot," he said. "Let us hope the day proves too dull for your talents." Poirot shook his hand lightly. "One may hope many things, monsieur." Halverson laughed, too loudly, and turned his head toward the staircase. Hastings followed the movement and saw the bride. Lydia Ashcombe stood halfway down the stairs, one hand resting upon the banister. She was dressed simply for the afternoon in pale blue-grey, and the quietness of her appearance made her beauty more striking, not less. Her dark hair was arranged with taste, her face was delicate, composed, and almost expressionless. Almost. For as Halverson laughed, Lydia froze. It was not dramatic. She did not gasp or step back or drop anything, but all life seemed to leave her face in an instant. The fingers resting on the polished wood tightened. Her eyes, which had been moving calmly over the hall, fixed for one moment on Halverson with such intensity that Hastings would have called it fear had it not been gone so quickly. Then she descended the remaining steps with perfect self-command. Julian moved to meet her. "Lydia, let me present—" But she had already inclined her head. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, how do you do?" Her voice was low and steady. Yet Poirot, Hastings noticed, looked not at her face but at her hands. She wore pale gloves, an odd thing indoors, though perhaps not impossible in a draughty country house, and when Julian touched her arm, she withdrew it, not abruptly, but with care. "Enchantée, mademoiselle," said Poirot. She smiled. It was lovely and entirely correct. But it did not seem to arise from pleasure. Rather, it resembled something chosen and put on like a veil. The afternoon passed in a soft blur of arriving guests, coats surrendered to servants, and polite exchanges in the drawing-room. Tea was served beneath tall windows overlooking the lawns. Names were offered and forgotten. Colonel Reginald Fawkes, a lean military man with clipped white moustaches, spoke sparingly and observed much. Dr. Lionel Renford, dark and intelligent, had the air of a professional guest who had been invited because good families liked a doctor near at hand. Everywhere there were flowers, everywhere there was elegance. Everywhere, too, there was listening. Poirot drifted lightly from one conversation to another, apparently idle, in fact, absorbing everything. Hastings, who knew him, saw the signs clearly. Poirot admired a vase while watching a doorway reflected in the glass. He asked an elderly aunt whether she preferred Devonshire cream, while observing who glanced up when Halverson crossed the room. He complimented the quartet and counted who failed to smile when Julian mentioned the evening toast. Shortly before dinner, Hastings found him standing alone beside the window in the morning room. "Well," said Hastings cheerfully, "have you detected some family scandal in the arrangement of the roses?" Poirot did not smile. "Tell me, my friend, what do you think of the bride?" Hastings considered. Beautiful, self-possessed, perhaps a little nervous. Brides usually are. And Monsieur Halverson? Oh, one knows the type. Loud, rich, and far too pleased with himself. Yes. Poirot folded his hands, and when he laughed in the hall, Hastings hesitated. She did seem startled. "Not startled," said Poirot quietly. "Checked, like a person who hears not merely a voice but a memory." Hastings frowned. "You think she knows him better than she ought?" "I think," said Poirot, "that several people in this house know one another better than they pretend." Dinner was announced at 7:30. The dining room was splendid. Candles glowed along the length of a polished table laid with crystal and silver. White flowers stood in low arrangements so as not to interrupt conversation. Place cards were set with almost military accuracy. Footmen moved silently behind the chairs. Lydia sat beside Julian near the centre. Halverson was placed only 4 seats away. Poirot noticed at once that Lydia's eyes went to the table before she sat down, not generally, as a hostess or bride might look, but exactly as though confirming positions already known to her. The first course was served. Conversation rose, fell, and rose again. Halverson spoke the loudest. Julian laughed where he must. Lady Dorothea corrected a servant with unnecessary smoothness. Verity Harrow, Julian's sister, watched everything with a tight and dry expression that suggested she trusted no one in the room, least of all the bride. Then Poirot observed something else. Lydia scarcely touched her wine. She lifted the glass once, brought it near her lips and lowered it again. A little later she repeated the gesture, but Hastings, seated farther down, would not have noticed what Poirot saw distinctly. She did not drink. Halverson, on the other hand, seemed in excellent humour. He called for more wine, contradicted Colonel Fawkes twice, and launched into a toast before the second course had been cleared. "To the happy couple," he cried, rising with flushed confidence, "and to the burial of old troubles." A pause followed. A tiny pause, no more than a breath. But within it, Poirot saw an entire drama. Julian's hand tightened on the stem of his glass. Verity looked down. Lady Dorothea became motionless, and Lydia, still as carved stone, turned her face very slightly toward Halverson. Then the moment passed. Glasses were raised. The murmurs of agreement circled the table. Halverson laughed and drank. Only Lydia did not. Poirot's eyes moved from her untouched wine to Halverson's face. The man had resumed his seat and was beginning some loud remark about old friendships when his expression changed. His words broke off. One hand went sharply to his throat. The colour in his face darkened. His chair scraped backwards. A lady gasped. Halverson half rose, swayed, and struck the table so violently that his glass toppled and rolled, spilling a red stain across the white cloth. Then he fell. Not gracefully, not slowly, but with the dreadful suddenness of a puppet whose strings have been cut. For one frozen instant, the room remained still. The candles burned. The silver shone. Somewhere beyond the closed doors, the quartet continued playing for 3 more bewildered seconds. Then came the screaming. Julian was on his feet. Dr. Renford hurried forward. Lady Dorothea gripped the table edge so hard that one knuckle showed white. Verity did not move at all. And Lydia! Lydia sat utterly motionless, one gloved hand resting in her lap, her face pale and unreadable. Poirot rose slowly. He looked first at the fallen man, then at the overturned glass, then very briefly at Lydia Ashcombe. When he spoke, his voice was low, but Hastings heard it clearly. "This wedding," said Hercule Poirot, "has begun with death." Chapter 2. The First Death. For several seconds after Benedict Halverson fell, the dining room remained caught in a silence so complete that it seemed almost unnatural. The candles burned steadily. The white flowers stood undisturbed. The red wine, slowly spreading across the cloth, crept outward like a quiet accusation. Then, as though some invisible thread had snapped, everything moved at once. "Doctor! Help him! Stand back, please! Stand back!" Chairs scraped sharply against the polished floor. A lady near the far end of the table gave a soft cry and covered her face. Servants rushed forward, uncertain whether to assist or retreat. Julian Harrow had already crossed the distance, his composure shattered. "Renford! Quickly!" Dr. Lionel Renford was beside the fallen man in an instant. He knelt, steady despite the confusion. Eugen placed 2 fingers against Halverson's neck. With careful movements, he turned the body slightly. Hastings, standing close by, felt a cold unease settle over him. Halverson's face had altered in a way that was unmistakable. The flush had deepened into something darker, more unnatural. His lips had taken on a faint, bluish tint. His eyes, half open, stared blankly at nothing. Dr. Renford listened for a moment longer, then slowly withdrew his hand. "I am afraid," he said quietly, "that Mr. Halverson is dead." The word seemed to ripple across the room. Dead. Only minutes earlier the man had been laughing, raising his glass, declaring his toast. Now he lay still upon the floor, as though the life had been removed from him with sudden and terrible precision. Julian stared, his voice strained. "Dead? That's not possible. He was perfectly well." "It appears to have been extremely sudden," said Dr. Renford carefully. "Possibly cardiac failure." "Heart failure," Hastings murmured. "Yes," said the doctor. "Such attacks can occur without warning." "Indeed," said a quiet voice. Hastings turned. Poirot had not moved far from the table. His gaze was not upon the body, but upon the place where Halverson had been seated. More precisely, upon the wine glass that lay on its side. The thin red line of spilled wine continued its slow spread across the white cloth. Lady Dorothea rose, her composure returning by sheer force of will. "Please," she said firmly, addressing the guests, "there is no cause for panic. A most unfortunate occurrence, but we must remain calm. Dinner will be discontinued."
I ask that you all retire to the drawing room." There was hesitation. A reluctance to leave the scene mingled with an equal reluctance to remain.
Gradually, the guests withdrew. Hastings lingered a moment longer beside Poirot. "Well," he whispered, "a dreadful business, but surely the doctor is right. A sudden seizure, perhaps." Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he bent slightly and lifted the fallen glass with delicate precision, holding it between his fingers as though it were an object of curiosity rather than a commonplace thing. "Hastings," he said softly, "tell me, what did you observe of our unfortunate Mr. Halverson during dinner?" Hastings frowned. He talked too much, drank rather freely, seemed in excellent spirits. "Yes. But what did he drink?" "Wine, of course." Poirot tilted his head. "Of course." Hastings hesitated. "Well, I assume so. Everyone was drinking wine." "Ah," said Poirot gently, "but assumption, my friend, is often the enemy of truth." He replaced the glass exactly where it had been. "You did not notice," he continued, "that Mr. Halverson's glass was filled only after the first course?" Hastings blinked. "Was it?" "Yes, and that he reached for it only after making his toast." Hastings looked back toward the table. "That is true. I believe it is." Poirot nodded slightly. "And yet," he added, "there is something even more curious." Before Hastings could press him further, Dr. Renford approached again. "I must ask that the room be cleared entirely," the doctor said. "The body must be attended to properly." "Certainly," said Poirot. "You consider it natural causes?" Dr. Renford hesitated just for a moment. "It is the most likely explanation." "But not the only one?" The doctor looked at him sharply. "Do you suggest otherwise?" Poirot inclined his head. "I suggest only that certainty should not come too quickly." Dr. Renford gave a brief nod. "Quite so." The drawing room, when they entered, was filled with subdued voices and strained expressions. The earlier brightness had vanished entirely. Guests stood in small groups, speaking in low tones, their eyes frequently returning to the door as though expecting further disturbance. Lydia Ashcombe sat near the window. She had not removed her gloves. Her posture was composed, her expression calm, but Poirot noticed that her hands were clasped more tightly than before. Julian stood beside her, speaking quietly. "I am so sorry," he was saying. "This should not have happened." "No," Lydia replied softly. "It should not." Her voice was steady, too steady. Hastings turned to Poirot. "What do you make of it?" Poirot did not answer directly. Instead, he asked, "Did you observe Mademoiselle Lydia during dinner?" Hastings frowned, only that she seemed rather nervous. "Not nervous," said Poirot. "Careful." "What do you mean?" "She lifted her glass," Poirot said quietly. "But she did not drink." Hastings stared. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely." "But why?" Poirot did not answer. At that moment, a young maid entered the room hurriedly, her face pale, her hands trembling.
"Lady Dorothea, ma'am, I found this in the dining room fireplace." She held out a small, blackened fragment of paper.
Lady Dorothea frowned. "What is it?" "I don't know, ma'am, but it was still warm." Poirot stepped forward at once. "May I?" The maid handed it to him gratefully. He examined it closely. Most of the paper had been consumed by flame, but a portion of the writing remained. He read it silently, then aloud. "You cannot bury the past forever." A silence fell. The words seemed to settle over the room with a weight far greater than their simplicity. Julian spoke first. "What does that mean?" No one answered. Colonel Fawkes shifted uneasily. "Some foolishness, no doubt. A joke taken too far." "A joke?" said Poirot softly. He folded the fragment carefully and placed it in his pocket. "No, Colonel," he said. "Not a joke." Hastings felt a distinct chill. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier. The guests no longer appeared merely uneasy. They appeared afraid. Poirot's gaze moved slowly across the assembled faces. From Julian, to Lady Dorothea, to Colonel Fawkes, and finally to Lydia Ashcombe. She met his gaze. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Recognition, not of identity, but of understanding. Poirot spoke quietly. "This, mesdames et messieurs, is no unfortunate accident." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. Dr. Renford, standing near the doorway, looked sharply at him. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the moment. He simply stated the truth. Mr. Halverson did not die of natural causes. A pause. Then, he was murdered. The silence that followed was deeper than any that had come before, and in that silence, the wedding, so carefully arranged, so delicately balanced, began to collapse entirely. Chapter 3. The Second Death. Morning came slowly to Rosewood Manor, as though the house itself resisted the arrival of daylight. A pale grey light filtered through the tall windows, touching the white flowers with a faint, lifeless glow. The previous evening's tragedy seemed to linger in every corridor. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. Even the servants moved with unusual care, their footsteps softened, their voices lowered almost to whispers. Hastings descended the staircase shortly after 8, expecting confusion, perhaps even departures. Instead, he found something far more unsettling: order. Breakfast had been laid in the smaller morning room. Silver gleamed, coffee steamed gently in porcelain cups. Toast was arranged neatly on covered plates. A few guests had already gathered, speaking in quiet tones,
as though determined to restore normality through discipline alone.
Julian Harrow stood near the window, his back to the room, his posture rigid. Lady Dorothea sat at the head of the table, composed but pale. Colonel Fawkes read a newspaper with exaggerated focus, though he had not turned a page since Hastings entered. "Extraordinary business," the colonel muttered. "Most unfortunate, but these things occur." Hastings did not reply. Poirot entered a moment later, as immaculate as ever, his manner calm, though his eyes held their usual thoughtful sharpness. "Well, Hastings," he said gently, "you observe how swiftly the world attempts to return to order." "Return?" Hastings said quietly. "It never left chaos." Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, but people prefer to believe otherwise." Breakfast passed in a strained silence. Lydia Ashcombe did not appear. At last, Julian turned. "The ceremony will proceed at 11, he announced. Hastings stared at him. "Proceed?" Julian's jaw tightened. "We cannot allow everything to collapse. Dr. Renford has suggested natural causes. There is no reason to create scandal." "No reason," Hastings repeated. Lady Dorothea spoke firmly. "It is decided." Poirot said nothing. But Hastings saw him watching Julian closely. Not with suspicion, with interest. At 10:30, Hastings found Poirot once more by the window. "You cannot approve of this," he said. "A man dies at dinner, and we proceed with a wedding as though nothing has happened?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "My friend," he said softly, "it is not approval that interests me, it is understanding." "Understanding what?" "Why they are so eager to continue." Hastings frowned. "Surely to avoid scandal." "Yes," said Poirot, "but scandal is not the only thing they fear." Before Hastings could ask more, the bell rang to summon the guests to the chapel. The chapel stood at the far edge of the estate, a small stone building surrounded by dark yew trees. The sky above it had turned a dull white, the air cold and still. Guests gathered quietly, their voices subdued, their expressions uncertain. The organ began to play. Julian took his place at the front. Hastings sat beside Poirot. "This is madness," he whispered. Poirot did not reply. Instead, he watched the door. It opened. Lydia Ashcombe entered. She wore her wedding dress now, white, simple, elegant. The fabric moved softly as she walked, her steps slow and controlled. Beautiful. Perfect. And yet, Hastings felt it at once. She did not look like a bride. She looked like someone approaching a decision already made. "She is afraid," Hastings whispered. Poirot shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "She is resolved." Lydia reached Julian's side. The ceremony began. "Dearly beloved." The familiar words filled the chapel. For a few moments, everything seemed almost normal again. Almost. Then, a scream tore through the air. It came from outside, sharp, sudden, terrible. The organ faltered. The minister stopped. Every head turned. Julian stepped forward at once. "Stay here," he said. But no one listened. The guests rose in confusion and hurried toward the door. The scream had come from the manor. By the time Hastings and Poirot reached the house, a small crowd had gathered at the base of the staircase. A maid stood trembling, her face white. "Miss Harrow," she won't answer. "I knocked. I tried the handle." Julian pushed past her. Stand aside. They ran up the stairs, along the corridor, to a door at the far end. Closed. Julian grasped the handle. Locked. A silence fell. Poirot spoke quietly. Break it. A footman stepped forward and forced the door with a heavy blow. The lock gave way. The door opened. Verity Harrow lay on the floor beside her dressing table. For a moment, no one moved. She was fully dressed, ready for the ceremony. One glove had been partially removed, hanging loosely from her fingers. Her head was turned slightly to one side. Her eyes were open, empty, dead. Hastings felt the same cold dread he had known the night before. Another death. Dr. Renford arrived quickly and knelt beside the body. He examined her carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each passing second. No visible injury, he said at last. No sign of struggle. Julian stared. Then what? Dr. Renford hesitated. There is something else. What? A scent. He leaned closer. Perfume. But not her usual one, I think. Poirot had already stepped into the room. He moved slowly, his gaze passing over every detail. The dressing table, the chair, the open jewellery case. Then, Verity's hand. He bent slightly. One glove removed, he murmured. But not entirely. Hastings stepped closer. What does that suggest? Poirot straightened. It suggests, he said quietly, that she trusted the person before her. Hastings felt a chill. No struggle, he said. No, Poirot agreed. No fear. He crossed to the window, closed, undisturbed, then to the door, locked. No one entered, Hastings said slowly. And no one left. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, he said softly. So it would seem. At that moment, a servant spoke from the doorway. The bride, sir. She was not in her room earlier. We thought she was here, but she was not. Hastings turned sharply. Poirot said nothing, but his eyes had already shifted toward Lydia. She stood near the doorway now, still, silent, watching. There was no visible shock upon her face, no distress, only that same quiet control. Julian stepped into the center of the room, his voice breaking at last. "This is madness," he said hoarsely. "First Halverson, and now Verity. What is happening in this house?" No one answered. The truth had not yet been spoken, but it was no longer hidden. Poirot's voice came quietly. "This is no madness, Monsieur Harrow." He paused. "It is design." Hastings felt the full weight of those words. 2 deaths, both deliberate, both precise, and now no longer invisible. Poirot glanced once more around the room, his mind already moving ahead. "The pattern has begun," he said softly, "and it has not yet finished." Chapter 4. Secrets beneath the wedding. By the time afternoon settled over Rosewood Manor, all pretense had vanished. The white flowers still stood in their silver vases. The ribbons remained tied along the banisters. The chapel doors were still open, waiting for a ceremony that would never now be completed. But the spirit of the house had altered completely. What had begun as unease had hardened into certainty. 2 deaths, and neither accidental. Hastings stood in the drawing room, watching as small groups of guests spoke in hushed, guarded tones. No one laughed now. No one attempted politeness beyond necessity. Every conversation seemed to end the same way, with a glance toward the staircase, or toward the doors, or toward the quiet figure seated near the window. Lydia Ashcombe. She sat exactly as she had before, still, composed, watching. But there was something different now. Hastings could not yet name it, but it unsettled him deeply. Nearby, Julian Harrow stood with Lady Dorothea, his voice low but strained. "This cannot continue," he was saying. 2 deaths under this roof. It is madness." "We must maintain control," Lady Dorothea replied sharply. Panic will only worsen matters. We must wait for proper authorities. Julian turned away abruptly. Wait! For what? Another body? The words seemed to fall heavily into the room. Poirot, who stood near the mantel, stepped forward at last. Monsieur Harrow, he said gently, there are certain questions which must now be answered. They cannot be delayed. Julian turned sharply. Questions? About what? Poirot met his gaze calmly. About the past. A silence followed, not long, but significant. Julian's expression changed, just slightly. I see no relevance, he said. Poirot inclined his head. On the contrary, I believe it is the only relevance that remains. Lady Dorothea stepped forward. This is hardly the time for speculation. It is precisely the time, Poirot said quietly. 2 people are dead. If we do not understand why, we shall not prevent what may yet come. Hastings felt the words settle over the room like a shadow. What do you mean? He asked. Poirot did not look at him. I mean, he said, that we must assume the danger is not yet over. A faint ripple of unease passed through those gathered. Julian's voice dropped. You think there will be another? Poirot's answer was calm. I think, he said, that someone has begun something, and such things are rarely abandoned halfway. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested that certain individuals join him in a smaller sitting room at the back of the house. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn partially across the windows. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, though it did little to ease the tension. Present were Julian Harrow, Lady Dorothea Ashcombe, Colonel Reginald Fawkes, and Lydia Ashcombe. Lydia entered last. She had changed from her wedding dress into a pale, simple gown. Without the formality of the ceremony, she appeared younger, almost fragile. Yet, as she took her seat, Hastings noticed something curious. She did not look at Julian, not once. Poirot remained standing. I will speak plainly, he said. There exists a connection between the 2 victims. It is not recent, but it is strong. Julian shifted impatiently. What connection? Poirot regarded him steadily. Mr. Halverson, Miss Verity Harrow, and yourself. Julian stiffened. That is absurd. No, said Poirot softly. It is not. Colonel Fawkes cleared his throat. If you refer to business dealings, those are private matters. There was a financial venture, Poirot continued calmly. 5 years ago. A small group, promising returns, encouraging trust. Julian's face had gone pale. That has nothing to do with a young woman was involved, Poirot said. Lydia's head lifted slightly. Hastings saw it, a fraction, but it was there. She invested everything she possessed, Poirot continued. She trusted those responsible, trusted them completely. Lady Dorothea spoke sharply. Investments fail. Such things are unfortunate, but not uncommon. Unfortunate, Poirot repeated. Yes, but not always accidental. He took a small step forward. Funds were moved, promises were made, and when the truth emerged, she was left with nothing. The room had grown very still. Hastings felt the weight of something unspoken pressing upon them all. What was her name? He asked quietly. Poirot answered without hesitation. Eleanor Voss. The name seemed to echo faintly. Julian turned away. Colonel Fawkes stared at the floor. Lady Dorothea's composure faltered just slightly, and Lydia had gone completely still. I remember her, she said suddenly. The words came too quickly, too clearly. Poirot watched her. Yes, he said gently. I believe you do. Julian's voice was strained. She came here once. It was years ago. She made accusations, wild accusations. She asked for help, Lydia said quietly. All eyes turned to her. She asked for what had been taken from her. Julian said nothing. She was desperate, Lydia continued. She believed she would be ruined. And was she? Hastings asked softly. Lydia's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Yes, she said. Poirot spoke again. She lost everything. Her money, her position, her future. And then? Hastings asked. Poirot paused. And then she died. The words fell softly but heavily. Hastings felt a chill. Died? He repeated. Yes. How? Poirot's gaze remained steady. That, he said quietly, was never clearly established. A long silence followed. The past had come into the room, and it did not leave. Julian spoke at last, his voice low. It was not our fault. No one responded. It was business, he insisted. Risk. She knew that. Did she? Poirot asked gently. Julian looked at him but did not answer. Poirot's gaze moved slowly across the room. Someone has not forgotten, he said. And that someone? Lady Dorothea asked, her voice barely steady. You believe is here? Poirot inclined his head. I do not believe, he said. I know. Hastings felt the tension tighten further. Outside, the wind moved faintly against the windows. Inside, the truth had begun to take shape. Not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet certainty that could no longer be ignored. Hastings looked at Poirot. You think the killer is among us? Poirot met his gaze. Yes. He paused. And I think, he added softly, that what we have seen so far is only the beginning. Chapter 5. The third murder. Evening descended upon Rosewood Manor with a quiet heaviness that no light could soften. The lamps were lit early, their warm glow stretching across polished floors and pale walls, yet the house felt darker than before. Shadows gathered in corners, lingering longer than they ought, as though reluctant to retreat. The earlier beauty of the place, its flowers, its music, its promise of celebration, had faded entirely. Now there was only waiting. Hastings felt it the moment he entered the drawing room. No one spoke freely. Conversations began and ended in fragments. Even the smallest sounds, a chair shifting, a glass set down too sharply, seemed to echo. 2 deaths had already occurred, and Poirot had said clearly, it was not finished. Lydia Ashcombe sat near the window once more, still, silent. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, gloved as before. The fading light framed her figure, softening her features, but not her expression. She no longer looked frightened. She looked decided. Julian Harrow stood across the room, speaking in low tones to Colonel Fawkes, though it was evident he was not listening. His eyes drifted repeatedly toward Lydia, then away again, as though drawn by something he no longer understood. Lady Dorothea remained seated, her posture rigid, her composure strained but intact. Dr. Renford stood near the door, thoughtful and increasingly uneasy. Poirot stood apart from them all, watching, always watching. Hastings crossed to him. Well, he said quietly, it is as you feared. The house is waiting. Yes, said Poirot. For what? Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he adjusted the position of a small ornament upon the mantelpiece, aligning it with meticulous care before replying. For completion, he said softly. Hastings frowned. Then you are certain? There will be another... Yes. The word was spoken without hesitation. Hastings felt a chill. Then why do we not prevent it? Poirot turned his head slightly. Because, he said, we do not yet know how. A little later, Julian excused himself. I require some air, he said shortly. And perhaps a moment of quiet. No one attempted to stop him. Hastings watched as he left the room. "He seems all shaken," he said. Poirot inclined his head. "He has reason." "Do you think he suspects?" Poirot's reply was thoughtful. "I think he understands more than he wishes to admit." A few minutes passed. Then a servant approached hesitantly. "Sir, Miss Ashcombe, she asked for Mr. Harrow. I believe she has gone to the study." Hastings glanced at Poirot. Poirot's eyes sharpened, but he said nothing. The house seemed to hold its breath. Time moved slowly, too slowly. Then a sound, a door closing, soft, almost deliberate. Poirot's head lifted. "Come," he said. They moved quickly through the corridor, past the dimly lit hall, toward the study at the far end. The door stood slightly ajar. A thin line of light escaped into the darkness beyond. Poirot paused only for a moment, then pushed it open. Julian Harrow sat behind his desk. For a single second the scene appeared ordinary. The lamp burned steadily. Papers lay scattered across the desk. A glass of whiskey stood untouched near his hand. Then Hastings saw his face and understood. Julian Harrow was dead. Hastings stepped back involuntarily. "Good God!" Poirot entered the room calmly. His gaze moved over everything. The desk, the glass, the position of the body. Julian sat upright, his head slightly inclined, as though he had been listening rather than speaking. There was no sign of struggle, no disturbance of furniture, no indication of fear, only stillness. Poirot bent slightly, examining the hand that rested loosely upon the arm of the chair. "No resistance," he murmured. "No," said Hastings faintly, "none at all." Dr. Renford was summoned once more. He arrived quickly, though his expression now carried none of the earlier confidence. He examined the body carefully, then straightened. "Poison," he said. "There can be no doubt." Hastings exhaled slowly. "3, he said. "Yes," said Poirot, "3 murders." The room seemed smaller now, closer, the air heavier. Hastings looked at the untouched whiskey. "But he did not drink," he said. "No," Poirot replied quietly. "Not from that glass." "Then how—" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he stepped back and observed the room once more. "The method has changed," he said. Hastings frowned. "Changed?" "Yes. The first was distant, the second closer. This one—" he paused, "required trust." Hastings felt the implication settle. "You mean—" "Yes," said Poirot softly. He knew who stood before him. They returned to the drawing room. The others had gathered once more. This time there was no pretense. Fear had taken hold completely. Lady Dorothea rose as they entered. "Well," she demanded, "what has happened?" No one answered immediately. Poirot spoke at last. "Monsieur Harrow is dead." The words struck the room like a blow. Colonel Fawkes swore under his breath. Dr. Renford remained silent. Lydia did not move. Hastings looked around the room. 3 deaths, all connected, all deliberate. "Poirot," he said quietly, "if all those involved in that past affair are dead, then what remains?" Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, his gaze moved slowly across the room, from Lady Dorothea to Colonel Fawkes, to Dr. Renford, and finally to Lydia Ashcombe. She met his gaze calmly, without fear, without surprise. Poirot spoke softly. "The most dangerous person, Hastings, is not the one who acts in anger." He paused. "But the one who acts with purpose." A faint silence followed. No one spoke. No one moved, and yet something had shifted, something subtle, something final. Hastings felt it. The pattern was complete, the truth close, very close. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "The time has come," he he said quietly. To gather everyone. Lady Dorothea frowned. For what purpose? Poirot met her gaze. To end this. Outside in the distance, the faint sound of approaching motor cars could be heard. Inside, the house seemed to settle into stillness once more. The wedding had ended, the past had returned, and now only the truth remained. Chapter 6. The Final Revelation. The drawing room of Rosewood Manor had never felt so still. Night had settled fully beyond the tall windows, pressing darkness against the glass like a silent witness. Inside, the lamps cast a steady golden light, yet no warmth remained. The flowers stood untouched. The chairs were arranged with care. Everything was as it had been prepared for celebration. Only the purpose had changed. Now it was a room for truth. One by one they gathered. Lady Dorothea Ashcombe, pale but upright, her composure strained to its limit. Colonel Reginald Fawkes, restless and unsettled, his military certainty shaken. Dr. Lionel Renford, thoughtful, silent, unwilling to speak too soon. And Lydia Ashcombe, seated near the centre of the room, calm, still, waiting. At the far side, near the fire, stood Hercule Poirot, small, composed, and utterly certain. Beside him, Arthur Hastings felt the weight of the moment settle heavily upon the room. Poirot glanced once around the assembled company. Then he began. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said gently, "we are met under circumstances most grave." No one spoke. 3 deaths, Poirot continued, each sudden, each deliberate, and each connected. Lady Dorothea's voice trembled, despite her effort to control it. "Then tell us who is responsible. This cannot continue." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "On the contrary, madame, it has already ended." A faint stir passed through the room. "The pattern is complete," Poirot said quietly. "There will be no 4th death." Hastings felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Poirot stepped forward. "To understand what has occurred, we must look not at this house, but at the past." He paused. 5 years ago, a financial venture was formed, promises were made, trust was encouraged, and a young woman, Eleanor Voss, was persuaded to invest everything she possessed. Colonel Fawkes shifted uneasily. Lady Dorothea's hands tightened upon the arms of her chair. "She lost everything," Poirot continued. "Her money, her position, her future." "And we have heard all this," Lady Dorothea said sharply. "It proves nothing." Poirot turned his head slightly. "It proves motive, madame." Silence. Poirot continued. "Miss Voss came here. She asked for help, for restitution. She was refused." Dr. Renford spoke quietly. "And she died?" "Yes," said Poirot. "How?" Hastings asked. Poirot's voice softened. "That was never clearly established. The room seemed to grow smaller. The past had entered it fully now. There was no escape from it." Poirot turned slowly. "So we ask ourselves, who would seek justice for such a wrong?" No one answered. "A stranger," Poirot continued. "Perhaps. But a stranger does not plan with such care, does not know the habits, the weaknesses, the opportunities." His gaze moved across the room. "No, this required someone closer." He paused. "Someone who could enter this house without suspicion." Another pause. "Someone who could be trusted." Hastings felt his pulse quicken. Poirot turned toward Lydia Ashcombe. "You came into their lives quietly," Poirot said. "With grace, with charm, with no cause for doubt." Lydia did not move. Her face remained calm. "You observed them," Poirot continued. "You learned their habits, their guilt, their fear." A faint breath passed through the room. "And when the moment came, you acted." Lady Dorothea rose abruptly. This is absurd. She is my niece. She is the bride. Yes, said Poirot gently. The bride. He took a step closer. Miss Lydia Ashcombe is not who she appears to be. For the first time, Lydia lifted her eyes. They were clear, steady, unafraid. Poirot spoke quietly. Her true name is Lydia Voss. The silence that followed was absolute. Hastings felt the shock strike through him. Voss, he whispered. Then Eleanor Voss. Was her sister, Poirot said. No one spoke. No one could. Lydia remained seated, still, calm. But now there was no mask. Poirot continued. You planned it carefully. Mr. Halverson first. He turned slightly. The wine, prepared in advance. You ensured the glass reached him. Hastings recalled the servant's words. The moved glass, the untouched wine at Lydia's place. Poirot continued. Miss Verity Harrow next. You used your own perfume. Knowing it would mislead, you relied on trust. She did not resist. Hastings thought of the glove, half removed. No struggle. Poirot's voice lowered. And finally, Julian Harrow. He paused. You married him. A faint sound escaped Lady Dorothea. Not for love, Poirot continued, not for security. Another pause, but for completion. Hastings spoke before he could stop himself. You married him, only to kill him? Lydia answered. Yes. Her voice was calm, unshaken. She rose slowly. For a moment, she seemed almost fragile again. Then she spoke. They destroyed her, she said. Her voice did not rise. They took everything, and when she begged for help, they turned her away. No one interrupted. They watched her fall, Lydia continued, and then they forgot. Her eyes moved across the room. To them it was nothing. A pause. To me, it was everything. Poirot watched her quietly. You hated them, he said. Yes, but not equally. Lydia hesitated, just for a moment. It was small, but Poirot saw it. Julian Harrow, Poirot said softly, you did not intend to kill him at once. Silence. You hesitated. Lydia's gaze shifted slightly. He knew, she said quietly. Hastings leaned forward. He knew. Yes, Lydia said. Her voice remained steady, but something beneath it had changed. He understood. Before the end, Poirot inclined his head. Yes, he said, and that is why there was no struggle. A long silence followed. No one spoke. No one moved. Poirot stepped forward once more. There are those, he said quietly, who believe justice must be taken into their own hands. He looked at Lydia. But justice and vengeance are not the same. Lydia met his gaze. I know. There was no regret in her voice, only certainty. From outside, the distant sound of motor cars approached. The police, at last. The moment lingered, then passed. Poirot turned slightly. The matter, he said softly, is concluded. Hastings looked around the room. The wedding was over. The house had changed. And the truth, quiet, patient, inevitable, had finally been revealed. Poirot spoke once more. A wedding, Hastings, is meant to unite hearts. He paused. But sometimes it reveals the deepest fractures of the human soul. And in the silence that followed, no one disagreed.